How on earth did the United States and the Soviet Union go from fighting on the same side to defeat Hitler to becoming two superpowers locked in a global struggle that nearly ended the world? It's an incredible story of how friends, or at least allies, became the bitterest of enemies. So let's get into it.
So picture this. World War II is finally over. The Allied leaders are meeting, but you could cut the tension with a knife. President Truman decides to play a power move. He casually mentions to Stalin that the US has this new, unbelievably powerful bomb. He's expecting to see shock, maybe fear.
So, how did it all fall apart so fast? Well, the truth is, the alliance between the capitalist USA and the communist USSR was always, a partnership of convenience. They were basically friends out of necessity because they had a much bigger problem to deal with: Nazi Germany. Once that common enemy was gone, all their massive fundamental differences came bubbling right back to the surface.
And when I say different, I mean they saw the world in completely opposite ways. The US was all about spreading democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had been invaded twice in just 30 years, and they were obsessed with security. Stalin's #1 goal was to build a buffer zone, a whole bunch of friendly communist countries in Eastern Europe that would protect Russia from another invasion from the West. As you can imagine, those two goals were never, ever going to work together.
Now, at the big post-war conferences, Stalin had promised everyone, yes, of course, we'll have free and fair elections in all those countries his army had just liberated. But that promise, that was broken almost immediately. One by one, Soviet-controlled puppet governments were installed. As one source put it, the elections were basically communist, 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 communist. Not exactly what you'd call a fair choice.
And this political takeover wasn't just some behind-the-scenes shuffle. No, this was the creation of a brand new, very real border that literally split the entire continent of Europe in half. A whole new phase of the conflict was beginning. And it got a name, a really famous one, from the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He called it the Iron Curtain. Now, at this point, it wasn't a physical wall you could see, not yet anyway. But it was a very real barrier, cutting off all of Eastern Europe from the rest of the world and becoming this powerful symbol of just how deep the freeze was between the old allies. So the West had to make a move. And what followed was this giant, high-stakes chess match played out across the globe. The US came up with a policy they called containment, basically doing whatever it took to stop communism from spreading any further. Meanwhile, the Soviets kept pushing, trying to expand their influence. And America's secret weapon in this chess match? It wasn't a bomb, it was cash. A lot of cash. The Marshall Plan poured $12 billion into rebuilding Western Europe. And get this, in today's money, that's over $130 billion. The idea was actually pretty simple. Countries that are prosperous and stable don't usually vote for communism. It was an economic firewall to stop the Soviets in their tracks. This whole thing set up a massive economic tug-of-war for the soul of Europe. While Western Europe was getting back on its feet with all this American money, Stalin, of course, couldn't just let his Eastern Bloc countries get tempted by all that capitalist cash. So he created his own rival plan, called Comecon, which essentially locked these countries into the Soviet economic system, for good. And nowhere was this fight more intense than in the city of Berlin. See, Berlin was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the city itself was divided between the Allies. Stalin decided to try and force the West out by cutting off all road and rail access to West Berlin, hoping to starve them into submission. But the West's response was incredible. They launched the Berlin Airlift. For almost a year, American and British planes flew in supplies 24/7. In the end, Stalin had to give up and lift the blockade. It was a huge, huge political win for the West. But this Cold War wasn't just going to be fought with money and politics. Pretty soon, the stakes were going to get raised dramatically. The conflict spread around the world, and it was about to turn from a cold standoff into a series of hot, bloody proxy wars. This was the moment everything changed. The moment the world really started to hold its breath. When the Soviets tested their own atomic bomb, the American nuclear monopoly was shattered. From this point on, any direct fight between the two superpowers carried the absolutely horrifying risk of mutual assured destruction. And just like that, the conflict went global.
In 1949, the fall of China to communism was a massive shock to the West. Then, only a year later, the Cold War turned hot for the first time when Soviet-backed North Korea stormed across the border and invaded US-backed South Korea. That domino theory, the fear that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would be next, it seemed like it was actually happening.
The Korean War became this brutal, direct fight. And when Chinese troops poured over the border to help North Korea, the American commander, the famous General Douglas MacArthur, he had a very simple and very terrifying solution. His suggestion? Nuke 'em. It just goes to show you how terrifyingly close the world was to an all-out nuclear World War III.
Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed in Washington. President Truman knew what was at stake. He understood that dropping the bomb on China would almost certainly drag the Soviet Union into the fight and trigger Armageddon. When MacArthur wouldn't back down and kept publicly pushing for a wider war, Truman did the only thing he could do. He fired him. It sent a clear message. Avoiding a world-ending war was priority number one.
After Stalin died in 1953, the whole game shifts again, and the spotlight swings right back to the epicenter of the whole conflict, the divided city of Berlin. It was about to become the most powerful and permanent symbol of the Cold War.
Now, the new guy in charge of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev, and he started things off by denouncing Stalin's crimes, talking about more freedom. It gave the whole world a little bit of hope. People started talking about a thaw in the Cold War. So the big question was, could this actually be it? Could things finally start to calm down? Well, the answer came fast, and it was a hard no. Anytime the people in Eastern Europe tried to test out this supposed new freedom, they were met with the same old answer: Soviet tanks. Uprisings in East Germany, a full-blown revolution in Hungary, protests in Poland, all of them were brutally crushed. The message was crystal clear. Khrushchev may not have been Stalin, but the Soviet Union's iron grip on its empire wasn't going anywhere. And that old Berlin problem just wouldn't go away. It was this giant thorn in the communist side. See, it was the one place on Earth where someone could literally just walk from the grim, oppressive East into the free and prosperous West. And millions of people did just that. It was a massive brain drain. Doctors, engineers, teachers, all fleeing. And it was crippling the East German state. So, Khrushchev's solution was as brutal as it was sudden. Imagine waking up one morning on August 13th, 1961, to find your city literally sliced in two by barbed wire fences. And soon that wire was replaced by a massive concrete wall with guard towers and a terrifying death strip. Just like that, the escape route was sealed. Families were torn apart, some for decades. The tension was just off the charts. Only a few months after the wall went up, a pretty minor dispute over an American diplomat's right to cross into East Berlin escalated into this: a terrifying standoff at Checkpoint Charlie. For 16 agonizing hours, American and Soviet tanks faced off, nose to nose, just a few yards apart. One wrong move, one itchy trigger finger, and that was it for everybody. The world just held its breath. And it was President Kennedy who really summed up what that wall meant. It wasn't just a barrier of concrete and wire. It was a giant, glaring admission of failure. It was proof that the communist system couldn't survive when its people had a choice. It had to physically build a prison to keep its own citizens from leaving. And really, that's the question it leaves us with. What's the true cost of an ideology that has to be enforced with walls and guards and guns?